In 1859, the plantation existed like a world sealed off from the rest of the country, a self-contained kingdom where the rules were written by one man and enforced by fear, habit, and tradition, and everyone living on that land understood those rules, whether they were ever spoken aloud or not, because silence itself carried instruction, and the unspoken rule was simple: everything belonged to the master, the soil, the crops, the buildings, the animals, and the people, and this belief shaped every decision made within the boundaries of that place, especially decisions involving blood, legacy, and power, which mattered more than kindness or truth. The master was a man who measured his worth not by his conscience, but by what he could pass down. And as the years passed without heirs born to the household, anxiety settled into him like a slow fever, whispering that his name might end, that the land he ruled would outlive him without carrying his mark forward, and in the rigid world of the South, where lineage was treated as proof of divine favor, infertility was not seen as a medical condition, but as a flaw that demanded correction. Two twin women lived under his roof, raised to believe that their purpose was to continue the family line, taught manners, obedience, and silence from childhood, praised for their appearance yet constantly reminded that beauty without heirs was failure. And as time passed and no children came, the household's atmosphere shifted from expectation to quiet accusation. Doctors were summoned, remedies attempted, prayers offered, but when nothing changed, blame settled entirely on the women, because in that society responsibility rarely moved upward or outward, it pressed downward until it found the least powerful place to rest. The master never considered that nature could deny him anything. Instead, he believed something had to be done, something practical, something decisive, and that belief was supported by a system that allowed him to treat humor. Lives as solutions to personal problems. On the same land lived hundreds of enslaved black men and women whose lives were governed by dawn bells and night counts, whose families could be separated at a word, whose bodies were valued for strength and endurance rather than humanity, and among them the master saw not individuals but resources, believing that whatever he ordered was justified by ownership. Conversations among overseers and trusted associates framed the situation not as moral wrongdoing, but as necessity, a private matter, a solution that had precedent in whispered history, even if it was never written down, and the master convinced himself that he was acting within the natural order as he understood it, where power defined morality and success excused cruelty. The plantation self-reflected this logic, with the big house standing elevated and white against the fields, symbolizing control and refinement, while the quarters sat farther away, crowded and worn, reminders of whose comfort mattered and whose suffering was invisible. Enslaved people sensed when decisions were being made about them long before words reached their ears, because tension traveled faster than awed. Airs and rumors moved through the quarters like shadows, warning that something was coming even if no one knew exactly what form it would take. Fear was not dramatic or loud, it was constant, a quiet pressure that shaped every thought, and when the master's concern over heirs became obvious, that pressure increased, because everyone knew that when powerful people felt threatened, they looked for control wherever they could find it. The women in the household felt it too, though in a different way, sensing that their value was slipping. That conversation stopped when they entered rooms, that pity replaced pride in the eyes of those around them, and yet they had no language to challenge it, no authority to protect themselves, because obedience had been taught as virtue and resistance as disgrace. The master framed his concern as duty, telling himself and others that preserving the family line was responsibility rather than obsession, and in doing so he erased the human cost of his intentions, because acknowledging that cost would have required admitting that enslaved people were not property, but people with memories, families, fears, and dignity. This way of thinking did not appear overnight. It was built over generations, reinforced by laws, churches, and customs that taught men like him that dominance was righteousness, and that suffering, if suffered by the enslaved, was part of an ordained order. By 1859, the nation was already cracking under the weight of these beliefs, though on this plantation the coming storm felt distant, like thunder heard far away, and the master AC. Ted as if his authority would last forever, as if the world would never question his right to decide the futures of others. The fields continued to produce, the house continued to host dinners, and outwardly life went on. But beneath that surface, something darker was forming, a decision rooted in fear of extinction and fueled by entitlement, one that treated human beings as instruments rather than lives. Enslaved men worked long hours under the sun, aware that strength made them visible and invisibility was often safer. Yet visibility was not always a choice, and selection could come without warning, turning an ordinary day into a moment that changed everything. The master's mind reduced complex human realities into simple calculations, believing that if his problem was infertility, then foe. RCE full intervention would solve it, and that belief ignored the truth that trauma does not produce stability, that coercion does not create legitimacy, and that power exercised without restraint eventually reveals its own emptiness. The plantation's unspoken rule ensured that no one openly challenged him, because challenge meant punishment, loss or death, and silence became survival, even when silence felt like complicity. In that silence, the master prepared to act, convinced that history would never judge him because history, as he understood it, was written by men like him, while the lives affected by his decision were expected to endure, forget, and disappear. The air itself seemed heavy with inevitability, as if the land had absorbed generations of suffering and now waited for the next injustice to be added to its memory, and though no official record would ever describe what was about to happen, the moral weight of the moment was real, shaped by a system that allowed one man's fear to override the humanity of many, setting the stage for an act that would leave scars long after the season changed and the fields were harvested again. The two men were chosen without warning, Beck. Orr's warning would have implied choice, and choice was never part of their lives, not in any meaningful sense, not since birth, and certainly not in 1859, on a plantation where a man's value was calculated by the strength of his back and the quietness of his mouth. They were known among the quarters not for rebellion or defiance, but for endurance, for the way they worked without complaint even when the sun burned low and the overseer's voice grew sharp, and this reputation, misunderstood by those in power as obedience rather than survival, made them visible in a way that was dangerous. One was older, with years of labor carved into his posture and a gaze that rarely lifted above the ground, not because he lacked awareness, but because looking directly at white authority had taught him consequences early in life, and the other was younger, broader in the shoulders, still carrying traces of youth in his movements, though that youth had long been stripped of softness by the discipline of the fields. They were summoned separately, then made to stand together, confused by the pairing, unsettled by the silence that surrounded the order, because no explanation was given, and explanation was rarely offered when the outcome was already decided. The overseer's tone was flat, almost bored, as if announcing an extra shift or a reassignment, but the location of the summons, the proximity to the big house, and the presence of the master himself signaled that this was not ordinary labor, and instinct told them that whatever awaited them would not end with the setting of the sun. Fear did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, tightening with each step closer to the house, fed by memories of past punishments, whispered stories of men taken for reasons never explained, and the knowledge that strength could become a curse when it attracted the wrong kind of attention. Neither man spoke because speech under such circumstances often led to misunderstanding, and misunderstanding led to violence. So they communicated through brief glances and shared silence, each understanding that the other felt the same tightening in the chest, the same uncertainty that pressed down harder than chains. The master looked at them not with anger but with assessment, the way one might look at livestock before purchase, checking build, age, usefulness, and in that gaze the men felt the familiar erasu, of personhood, the reminder that their names, histories, and inner lives were irrelevant to the decision being made. He did not ask them anything, because questions implied the possibility of refusal, and refusal did not exist within the plantation's logic. So instead he spoke to the overseer, using their bodies as reference points rather than addressing them directly, discussing them as if the why were not present, as if their hearing did not matter, as if understanding would not increase their suffering. Orders were given in fragments, careful not to be explicit, cloaked in euphemism and authority, but the meaning was clear enough to those who lived under such power, and clarity brought with it a different kind of terror, one rooted not in physical pain alone, but in humiliation and loss. Self. The men were dismissed and told to wait, because waiting was another form of control, a way to stretch fear over time, and as they stood apart from the others, they felt the weight of isolation settle on them, knowing that whatever had been decided would mark them, even if no one ever spoke of it again. In the quarters that night, whispers followed them, questions formed but were not asked. Because curiosity could be dangerous, and everyone understood that when the master's interests were involved, silence was protection, not betrayal. The older man thought of his wife, sold years earlier to a neighboring plantation, a memory that had learned to stay buried but now rose uninvited, reminding him that intimacy, love, and family had always been vulnerable to interference, always subject to removal by force. And the younger man thought of his mother, who had taught him early that survival meant obedience outwardly and resistance inwardly, a lesson that now felt thin against the enormity of what was coming. Neither man believed that compliance meant consent, but they also knew that resistance would not bring justice, only punishment that might spread beyond them to others they cared about, because the system was designed to make one person's suffering a warning to many. As dawn approached, sleep did not come easily, and the hours stretched long, filled with imagined outcomes and half-formed prayers that did not ask for escape, but for endurance. Because escape was not a realistic hope, not in a world where every road led back to control. When morning arrived, the plantat. Ion moved as it always did. Bells ringing, work assigned, routines maintained. And this normalcy felt cruel in its indifference, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge the significance of what was about to occur. They were taken again, this time escorted, not roughly but firmly, because roughness was unnecessary when authority was unquestioned, and as they walked past familiar spaces now, charged with new meaning, they felt a separation grow between who they had been and who they were becoming, shaped not by choice but by violation. The master justified his selection to himself through distorted logic, believing that strength equaled suitability, that silence equaled agreement, and that the absence of protest equaled moral permission, ignoring the truth that power suppresses protest long before it erases suffering. In his mind, the men were fulfilling a function, solving a problem, and he did not consider the cost, because cost was something he had never been required to pay. For the men, however, cost was everything, measured in dignity stripped away piece by piece, in the knowledge that their bodies could be commandeered not only for labor, but for purposes that reached into the most private parts of existence. They understood that what was being demanded of them would bind them forever to a story they did not write, that even if no one spoke of it openly, memory would keep record, and memory could be as heavy as chains. The walk toward the house felt longer than any march to the fields, because the destination represented a crossing of boundaries that should never have been crossed, and with each step the men felt the shrinking of the space where they could still see themselves as whole. They were not naive. They knew that slavery had always involved control over bodies, but this demand carried a different weight, one that twisted power into something deeply personal and profoundly violating, erasing the last illusion that any part of their lives was protect. From intrusion. The younger man clenched his hands, nails pressing into skin, grounding himself in physical sensation to avoid the spiral of thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him, while the older man focused on breathing, counting steps, using the same strategies he had learned during long days under the whip, because survival had taught him methods that did not involve hope. Neither man believed that history would remember them as individuals, and that knowledge added another layer of pain, because being used and then forgotten felt like a second erasure, one that followed the first and confirmed the system's success. The plantation absorbed their footsteps without comment, the walls of the big house standing indifferent, polished by wealth built on suffering, and as they crossed into its shadow, they understood that whatever happened inside would not remain contained there, that it would follow them back to the fields, into their sleep, into every future moment shaped by this forced participation. The choice of them was not random, and that knowledge hurt almost as much as the act itself, because it meant that their perceived qualities, their endurance, their silence, had been turned against them, transformed into reasons for exploitation rather than survival. They were not allowed to prepare, to speak, or to refuse, and in that absence of agency, the full cruelty of the system revealed itself, showing that it did not require hatred to function, only indifference reinforced by power. As the door closed behind them, the world narrowed, and though the event itself would never be described in official records, the moment marked a clear truth that would live with them long after, that their bodies were not their own, that their pain was invisible by design, and that the plantation's order depended not just on labor extracted from muscle, but on the systematic breaking of boundaries that should have protected the human spirit. The twin women had grown up believing. The house itself was watching them, shaping them, teaching them how to move, how to speak, how to disappear politely when their presence was no longer required. And by 1859, that house felt less like a home and more like a quiet enclosure where expectations pressed in from every wall. From childhood, they had been instructed that their lives followed a single clear path, one that led from obedience to marriage to motherhood, and every lesson, every compliment, every reprimand was designed to prepare them for that destination, because in their world a woman's worth was measured not by her thoughts or desires, but by her ability to continue a family line. As twins, they were often treated as a matched set, dressed alike, praised alike, compared alike, and this constant pairing blurred their individuality until even they sometimes struggled to remember where one ended and the other began. Yet beneath that surface similarity, each carried her own fears, her own private doubts, her own quiet resistance that never found words. When marriage came, it was not a romantic choice, but an arrangement that confirmed their role within the household. And when years passed without children, the atmosphere around them changed in ways that were subtle at first, and then impossible to ignore. Conversations grew careful, glances lingered too long, and kindness took on the sharp edge of disappointment, because infertility was treated not as misfortune but as failure, and failure in women was considered both personal and shameful. Physicians examined them with professional distance that masked judgment, offering remedies and reassurances that gradually gave way to silence when nothing worked, and prayers were spoken over them not as comfort but as correction, as if faith itself could force their bodies into obedience. The twins learned to carry this burden quietly, because questioning it would have meant challenging an entire structure built on male authority and tradition, and challenging that structure was not something they had been taught how to do. Within the household, they occupied a strange position, elevated above the enslaved yet powerless in crucial ways, protected by status but confined by expectation, and this contradiction created a kind of isolation that felt suffocating, because they were surrounded by people and yet profoundly alone. They understood that their failure to produce heirs threatened more than their own standing. It threatened the master's sense of permanence, his belief that his name would endure, and this knowledge weighed on them heavily, because responsibility had been placed on their bodies without their consent. When the master's mood darkened, they felt it immediately, sensing that something was being considered, something drastic, because like him, did not accept limitation easily, and the idea that nature might deny him heirs felt to him like an insult that required correction. The twins were not consulted, because consultation implied choice, and choice was not extended to women in matters that involved lineage and control, so instead they were informed, gradually and indirectly, through shifts in behavior, changes in routine, and the tightening presence of supervision that signaled a loss of privacy they had never fully possessed to begin with. Shame became a constant companion, though it did not originate within them, and they struggled to reconcile the belief they had been taught that virtue lay in obedience with the growing sense that obedience was being used to justify something deeply wrong. They were expected to accept decisions made about their bodies with composure and gratitude, because resistance would have marked them as ungrateful, hysterical or sinful, labels that could strip them of the limited protection their status afforded. In quiet moments, each twin questioned whether her own thoughts were betrayal, whether feeling fear or anger meant she was failing yet again, and this internal conflict was as punishing as any external force, because it turned self-preservation into guilt. The house that had once represented refinement now felt heavy with unspoken intent, every corridor echoing with anticipation they could not escape. And though no explicit threat was spoken, the implication was clear: their bodies were not entirely their own, and whatever solution the master chose would be an act regardless of their comfort. They were instructed to maintain appearances, to continue hosting, smiling, and fulfilling social roles, because public perception mattered, and the preservation of respectability required that private violations remain hidden, framed as necessity rather than cruelty. This demand for composure added another layer of imprisonment, because it forced them to perform no and malcy while their inner world fractured under the pressure of impending loss of control. They were aware of the enslaved people on the plantation, not as abstract labor, but as constant presence, faces they passed daily, lives intertwined with theirs, through proximity if not equality, and this awareness complicated their fear, because they understood, however imperfectly, that whatever was being and would not harm them alone. Yet, this understanding did not grant them power to stop it. It only added guilt to fear, because empathy without agency can feel like complicity, even when resistance carries its own unbearable cost. The twins had been taught to see themselves as gentle, delicate, protected, but this protection was conditional, and as their perceived usefulness diminished, so did care extended to their comfort, revealing that their value had always been transactional. Nights became restless, sleep interrupted by thoughts they could not share with anyone, because speaking openly would have meant acknowledging the reality they were being trained to accept, and once acknowledged, it would be impossible to retreat back into denial. Each twin coped differently, one withdrawing into quiet routines, finding solace in repetition and order, the other restless and watchful, scanning faces for signs, trying to anticipate decisions that were already made beyond her influence. They leaned on each other in small, silent ways, shared glances, subtle gestures of reassurance, because twinhood had taught them a language that did not require words. Yet even this bond felt strained, under the weight of what was coming, because they knew they might be separated not physically but emotionally, each forced to endure an experience that would alter how she saw herself and the world. The master framed his intentions as practical, even benevolent, suggesting that the outcome would resolve tension and restore balance, but this language only deepened the violation because it attempted to sanitize an act rooted in domination and fear. The twins recognized the lie in this framing, though they lacked the authority to challenge it openly, and this recognition marked a turning point in their understanding of the world they inhabited, because it revealed that morality within that system was flexible, bending to accommodate power rather than justice. Their consent was assumed rather than sought, and assumption functioned as erasure, stripping them of voice while preserving the illusion of order, and in this erasure they experienced a loss that went beyond physical autonomy, touching the core of identity itself. They were expected to comply not because compliance was right, but because resistance would disrupt the hierarchy that sustained everyone's roles, and disruption was rated as a greater crime than cruelty. The silence surrounding the plan was deliberate, designed to prevent questions, to keep discomfort contained, and to allow everyone involved to pretend that what was happening was unfortunate but necessary, a narrative that protected reputations at the expense of truth. As the moment drew nearer, time seemed to stretch and contract unpredictably, days blurry. Together, while certain hours felt unbearably sharp, each minute filled with awareness of what could not be stopped. The twins found themselves mourning something they could not name openly, the loss of innocence that had already been compromised by expectation, the loss of trust in a system that claimed to protect them, and the loss of the simple belief that their bodies belonged to them alone. In private reflections, they questioned whether history would ever recognize their suffering, whether future generations would understand the cost of preserving appearances, or whether their pain would be absorbed into the larger story of the plantation rendered invisible by privilege and silence. They sensed that whatever happened would bind them forever to the enslaved people whose lives were being used to solve a problem they did not create. And this shared entanglement felt like a tragic truth the system refused to acknowledge. The house remained outwardly calm, routines continued, meals were served, and visitors saw nothing amiss, but beneath that surface the twins lived in a state of suspended dread, aware that their role had shifted from daughter and wife to vessel, from individual to means, and this shift revealed the limits of their status in a world governed by control. They did not scream, because screaming would have been dismissed as hysteria, and they did not flee, because flight would have been impossible, so they endured, learning in that endurance the bitter lesson that protection offered by power is never unconditional. As they waited, they felt the walls of expectation close in, understanding that the silence demanded of them was not neutrality but participation, and that their quiet suffering would be used to preserve a narrative of order, even as it concealed a profound moral collapse at the heart of the plantation's authority. What followed was never named openly, because naming would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have shatter. The carefully maintained illusion that everything occurring within the plantation was orderly, justified, and necessary, so instead it unfolded under the cover of authority, silence, and routine, framed not as an act of violence but as a solution, a grim correction to a problem the master believed should never have existed in the first place. In his mind, this was not cruelty but management, not violation but strategy, and that distinction allowed him to proceed without hesitation, because the system that empowered had long taught that power itself was proof of righteousness. The arrangement was presented as inevitable, stripped of emotion and humanity, reduced to function, and everyone involved was expected to comply, as if compliance erased harm, as if obedience could transform coercion into legitimacy. The men were brought forward not as individuals but as instruments, their presence justified by distorted reasoning that equated silence with willingness and endurance with consent, ignoring the truth that fear often looks like calm when resistance is punished. The women were instructed, not asked, guided by implication rather than explanation, because explanation would have invited questions, and questions were dangerous to the narrative the master needed to maintain. The house that had once symbolized refinement now became a stage for domination, disguised as necessity, its polished floors and quiet rooms bearing witness to an act that violated boundaries no civilized society should have crossed, yet which this society enabled without hesitation. No vows were spoken. No recognition of personhood offered, because recognition would have implied equality, and equality was incompatible with the hierarchy that sustained the plantation's order. What occurred was transactional, enforced by power rather than mutuality, and the emotional devastation it caused was treated as irrelevant, because feelings were not accounted for in calculations of lineage and control. The master convinced himself that the absence of overt resistance meant acceptance, failing or refusing to understand that resistance had been systematically crushed long before this moment, leaving compliance as the only survivable response. Those who facilitated the process did so with practiced detachment, focusing on procedure rather than consequence, because detachment allowed them to avoid conflict. Haunting their own complicity, and complicity, once acknowledged, could not be undone. The men carried the weight of humiliation alongside fear, aware that their bodies were being used not only against their will, but against their identity, transformed into tools for preserving a legacy that excluded them entirely. The women carried a different but equally profound burden, forced to reconcile obedy, NCE with violation, expected to remain composed while their autonomy dissolved under the pressure of expectation and authority. No one spoke of consent, because consent did not exist within the framework governing this act. It was replaced by command, obligation, and the threat of consequence, a substitution that revealed the moral emptiness at the heart of the system. The master observed from a distance, satisfied that his will was being enacted, interpreting control as success, and never questioning whether success achieved through domination could produce anything other than trauma. He believed that results would justify means, that the future would erase the ugliness of the present, and that time itself would absolve him, a belief common among those insulated by power. The plantation scene continued its rhythms around this event. Fields worked, meals served, conversations held, as if normalcy could coexist with profound violation. And in this coexistence, the cruelty of the system became most apparent, because it demonstrated how easily horror could be absorbed into routine when those responsible were not required to feel its impact. The enslaved community sensed the shift immediately. Not through words, but through atmosphere, through the heaviness that settled over the quarters, through the altered expressions of those involved, through the unspoken understanding that something irreversible had occurred. Yet even among them, silence prevailed, because speaking openly would have invited punishment, and survival required restraint, even when restraint felt like betrayal of one's own humanity. The men involved were expected to return to their labor as if nothing had happened, their compliance treated as proof that no harm had been done, and this expectation compounded the trauma, because it denied them space to process, to grieve, or to reclaim any sense of self. The women were expected to resume their roles with grace, to embody respectability, to smile at visitors and participate in social rituals that now felt hollow because respectability depended on concealment, and concealment demanded emotional erasure. The master's language framed the act as private, necessary, and temporary, suggesting that once the desired outcome was achieved, order would be restored. But this framing ignored the reality that order built on violation is inherently unstable, because it relies on continued silence and denial. The cost of that silence was borne entirely by those without power, their suffering rendered invisible by design, their pain absorbed into the foundation of a legacy they would never share. Within the house, the women struggled to reconcile their internal sense of wrongness with the external insistence that everything was as it should be, and this dissonance created a fracture that no amount of composure could fully conceal. Within the fields, the men carried the knowledge that their bodies had been claimed in a way that stripped even the illusion of autonomy, and this knowledge followed them into every task, every interaction, every quiet moment when memory surfaced uninvited. The master interpreted the absence of chaos as success, failing to recognize that silence achieved through fear is not peace, and that compliance extracted under threat does not equal harmony. He did not see the long-term consequences forming beneath the surface, the erosion of trust, the deepening of resentment, the quiet despair that settled into the plantation's social fabric like rot beneath polished wood. Those who knew what had happened were bound by mutual implication, their silence reinforcing the system even as it trapped them within it, because speaking out would have exposed not only the master's cruelty, but the broader structure that allowed it to occur. The act itself was not recorded, because records required justification, and justification would have demanded language that could withstand scrutiny. something this act could not provide, so it was instead absorbed into the category of things everyone knew but no one acknowledged. The master awaited results with a confidence rooted in entitlement, believing that control over bodies equaled control over outcomes, and this belief reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of humanity, one that reduced life to function and ignored the psychological and moral dimensions of existence. As time passed, the immediate shock gave way to a heavy endurance, because those affected learned that survival required compartmentalization, the ability to separate what had been done to them from what was demanded of them daily. This compartmentalization was not healing, it was armor, necessary but heavy, and it shaped how they moved through the world. From that point forward, the plantation's order remained intact on the surface, but beneath that surface it had been irrevocably altered, because an unspoken line had been crossed, revealing the extent to which power could intrude into the most intimate aspects of life without accountability. The transaction achieved its immediate purpose in the master's mind, but it failed in every moral sense, because it transformed human beings into means, erasing the distinction between authority and abuse. Those involved understood, even if they could not articulate it openly, that what had occurred would never truly end because its impact would echo through memory, behavior, and identity long after the moment itself passed. The master did not perceive this echo because his position insulated him from consequence, allowing him to mistake silence for resolution and obedience for agreement. In reality, the act deepened the plantation's reliance on denial, reinforcing a system that demanded emotional sacrifice from the powerless while rewarding the powerful with the illusion of control. The absence of overt conflict was interpreted as stability, but stability achieved through coercion is fragile, dependent on continued suppression, and incapable of producing genuine order. What remained after the act was not peace but a quiet devastation, one that settled into the lives of those affected and reshaped their understanding of safety, autonomy, and worth. The plantation continued to function, but it did so carrying the weight of an unacknowledged crime, one that would shape relationships, perceptions, and legacies in ways no ledger or record could capture. The master believed he had solved a problem, but in truth he had exposed the deepest flaw in the system he relied on, demonstrating that when power is unchecked, it does not merely exploit labor, it consumes humanity itself, leaving behind a hollow order sustained by silence, fear, and the unspoken knowledge that something essential had been irrevocably broken. What came after did not arrive as closure, but as continuation, because events shaped by power rarely end cleanly. They simply move forward, carrying their weight into whatever follows. And on the plantation the future unfolded under the influence of a decision that everyone felt yet no one named, a decision that altered the meaning of routine, family, and identity, in ways that could not be undone by time alone. The master watched the days pass with a sense of grim satisfaction, interpreting outward calm as proof that his authority had restored order, and in doing so he mistook silence for acceptance, because silence fit his understanding of control better than truth ever could. He spoke of destiny and necessity when he spoke at all, framing what had happened as an unpleasant but effective intervention, and this framing allowed him to avoid confronting the reality that the cost of his solution had been paid entirely by others. Within the household, behavior adjusted subtly. Conversations turned toward continuity and future prospects, and attention shifted from the act itself to what it was supposed to produce, because focusing on outcomes helped everyone avoid the moral discomfort of examining process. The twin women moved through their days with a practiced composure that concealed more than it revealed, learning to inhabit their roles with precision, because precision reduced scrutiny, and scrutiny threatened to expose emotions they were not permitted to express. Their sense of self became increasingly divided, one part performing gyara Attitude and stability, the other holding memory and resentment in careful containment, because allowing those feelings to surface would have disrupted the fragile protection their status still provided. Praise replaced pity, yet the praise felt hollow, because it confirmed what they had always feared, that their value was conditional and dependent on fulfilling expectations set by others rather than by themselves. They understood that their bodies had become symbols rather than selves, vessels through which authority sought validation, and this understanding reshaped how they experienced intimacy, motherhood, and even their own reflections, because once a boundary is violated, it does not automatically rebuild itself. Between the twins, the bond endured but changed, strengthened by shared understanding yet burdened by shared silence, because what they knew could not be spoken openly without consequence, and so it lived between them in glances and gestures rather than words. The men returned to their labor as ordered, their lives outwardly unchanged, and this outward sameness was itself a form of violence, because it denied the significance of what they had been forced to endure, aiding it as an interruption too insignificant to warrant acknowledgement. They carried the memory internally, learning to compartmentalize experience as a survival strategy, separating what had been done to them from what was demanded of them each day, because survival within the system required that kind of division. Over time, this internalization shaped how they related to authority, to community, and to themselves, reinforcing caution, restraint, and emotional distance as necessary tools rather than choices. Among the enslaved community, understanding circulated without clarity, fragments of awareness passing through careful speech and shared observation, and this incomplete knowledge deepened an already profound sense of vulnerability because it demonstrated that exploitation had no fixed boundary and could reach into any aspect of life when power desired it. Children grew up absorbing this atmosphere without being told its source, learning lessons about obedience, danger, and silence through observation rather than instruction, and these lessons embedded themselves deeply because they were learned through lived experience rather than abstract teaching. The master interpreted continued productivity as confirmation that the plantation remained healthy, failing to see that productivity achieved under coercion does not reflect well-being, only endurance, and his position insulated him from the emotional and psychological costs borne by others. He aged with confidence, convinced that his legacy had been secured, and this conviction allowed him to overlook the subtle distance that grew between himself and those around him, the way conversations became careful, the way genuine warmth was replaced by formal respect. He attributed any lingering tension to temperament or circumstance rather than trauma, because acknowledging trauma would have required acknowledging responsibility, and responsibility would have disrupted the narrative that protected his sense of righteousness. The women aged too, carrying the experience forward into later years, their understanding of womanhood shaped by the knowledge that their autonomy had been overridden by authority, and this knowledge influenced how they navigated relationships, how they taught the next generation about duty and safety, and how they understood their own resilience. The men aged with memory intact, though Ely articulated, and these memories inform the guidance they offered to younger people, emphasizing awareness, caution, and the importance of protecting one's inner life when external control could not be resisted. They did not frame these lessons as stories of the past, but as practical wisdom for survival, because wisdom was less likely to provoke questions that could lead to harm. As the nation moved closer to upheaval, the plantation's internal order persisted, yet it did so under strain, because systems built on denial require constant reinforcement, and any change in circumstance threatens to expose their fragility. When broader historical shifts eventually arrived, altering legal structures and social arrangements, the internal consequences of what had occurred did not simply dissolve, because psychological inheritance does not obey the same timelines as political change. Those who carried memories into new circumstances found that freedom did not automatically grant language for what had been endured. And without language, experience often remains unresolved, shaping behavior indirectly rather than through conscious reflection. Descendants inherited questions without clear answers, feelings of caution or mistrust without obvious origin, and these inherited uncertainties became part of their identity, influencing how they understood authority, belonging, and intimacy. Stories passed down emphasized endurance, propriety, and resilience, while omitting the specific conditions that had made such endurance necessary, because omission protected dignity even as it obscured truth. Official histories remained silent, because official histories often privilege public events over private violations, and this silence allowed the plantation's narrative to appear orderly and respectable long after its more. Foundations had been compromised, yet absence from record did not equate to absence from reality, because the consequences of the act continued to shape lives in subtle but persistent ways, influencing choices, relationships, and expectations long after the original participants were gone. The land itself changed hands over time, as land always does, and new owners walked the same paths unaware of the specific decisions that had shaped the atmosphere they inherited. Yet the atmosphere remained, because places absorb human experience and retain it in ways that are felt even when not understood. Crops grew, buildings stood, routines resumed, and to an outside observer the plantation might have appeared unchanged, but beneath that appearance lay a fracture that never fully healed, because healing requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement had been consistently denied. The master's name endured for a time, attached to property and lineage, yet the moral cost of preserving that name was never paid by him, only carried by those whose lives had been used to secure it. The ultimate legacy of the act was not stability but distortion, demonstrating how unchecked power reshapes human relate. Iron ships into transactions and teaches silence as a survival skill. Those who lived through it understood, even without articulating it, that the deepest damage was not physical alone but moral, because it taught that cruelty could be normalized when cloaked in authority and necessity. This lesson lingered across generations, shaping how people responded to power, how they protected themselves, and how they understood their own worth within systems that had long denied it. In this way, the act continued to exist beyond its immediate moment, not as a single event, but as an influence, a force that shaped behavior and belief long after its origin was forgotten. The plantation's Rye, incomplete and fragmented, serves as a reminder that some histories survive not in documents but in consequences, and that the most enduring scars of injustice are often those carried quietly forward, embedded in patterns of silence, resilience, and caution that persist until someone chooses to listen to what those patterns reveal about the past that created them.